The sterile, harsh fluorescent lights of the Mercedes Scripps Hospital trauma bay flickered, casting long, exhausted shadows across the linoleum floor. The air, thick with the metallic tang of dried blood and antiseptic, was a testament to the war fought within these walls. Sarah Jenkins stood at the stainless steel sink, her shoulders slumped with a bone-deep weariness that no amount of caffeine could cure. She methodically scrubbed her hands, watching the water run a rusty, pale pink before finally clearing. She was 32, but the deep lines etched around her eyes, like a cartographer's map of stress and sleepless nights, told the story of a woman who had lived a dozen lives in the span of a decade. For the past 36 hours, Sarah had been the first line of defense against a massive pileup on Interstate 5. As the head charge nurse, she was a legend among the residents and attending physicians for her glacial calm under catastrophic pressure. When arteries burst and monitors flatlined, Sarah didn't panic. She moved with a calculated, almost mechanical precision that left the younger doctors in stunned silence. They didn't know where she had learned to stabilize a hemorrhaging patient with such ruthless efficiency, and she never offered the story. It was a secret she carried with her, a part of her past she kept sealed away behind a wall of professional composure. Glancing at the wall clock, Sarah cursed under her breath. It was 8:15 a.m. She stripped off her biohazard gown and tossed it into the red bin, but kept on her navy blue scrubs. There was no time for a shower or to change into the prim, conservative blouse and pencil skirt hanging in her locker. She had exactly 45 minutes to cross downtown San Diego, navigate the labyrinthine security of the San Diego County Superior Court, and take the stand. She was running on fumes, her body aching for sleep, but her mind was a razor's edge, sharpened by a singular focus. Grabbing her keys, Sarah reached into the dark recess of her locker and pulled out the only outerwear she had worn all week, a bulky, olive-green soft-shell tactical jacket. It was completely out of regulation for a civilian hospital environment. The material was frayed at the cuffs, scorched black along the left shoulder, and permanently stained with something dark and unidentifiable near the hem. On the right shoulder, fastened by a worn Velcro patch, was a dull, dirt-caked emblem. It bore no name, only a cryptic call sign embroidered in faded black thread, Pantom 4. She shrugged the jacket on instantly, feeling the familiar, weighted presence of the ballistic nylon settle on her shoulders. It was a shield for what she was about to face in the civil court. She needed armor. Sarah drove her battered Ford Bronco through the dense morning traffic, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She wasn't going to court for herself. She was going for James Hickens. James was a 24-year-old former Navy medic, a kid who had been deployed to the worst corners of the globe before he was even old enough to buy a beer. Now, he faced serious charges of aggravated assault. 3 weeks prior, James had intervened when 3 men were harassing a young waitress in a downtown alley. The resulting physical altercation had left 2 of the aggressors in the ICU. Unfortunately for James, one of those men was the son of a prominent local real estate developer. The narrative had twisted quickly. James was painted as a violent, unhinged veteran suffering from PTSD, a dangerous menace who had brutally attacked innocent bystanders. Sarah was his only character witness. She knew James, and more importantly, she knew what it meant to be discarded by the very system you bled for. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse at a run. The security guards at the metal detectors gave her a long, suspicious look at her stained scrubs and battered jacket, double-checking her bag before finally waving her through. Courtroom 402 belonged to the Honorable Judge Richard Cowbell. Cowbell was an institution in the San Diego judicial system, known for his courtroom's draconian rules, his immaculate mahogany bench, and his absolute contempt for anything that disrupted his meticulously ordered docket. He was a man who believed justice was intrinsically linked to presentation. A poorly tied tie was an insult. A shirt tail out was a sign of moral failing. When Sarah pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the session was already underway. The room thrummed with tension. James sat at the defense table, looking small and defeated in an ill-fitting suit. Beside him, a visibly overwhelmed public defender shuffled a disorganized pile of papers. At the prosecution's table, a team of expensive lawyers whispered confidently amongst themselves. The public defender stood, his voice trembling slightly. The defense calls Sarah Henkins. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the scorched nylon of her jacket brush against her skin. She walked down the center aisle, her rubber-soled nursing shoes squeaking softly against the polished wood floor. All eyes in the courtroom turned to her. Judge Cowbell observed her over his half-moon spectacles. His face, normally a mask of judicial indifference, twisted instantly into a deep frown. He took in her navy blue scrubs, the faint traces of organic matter near her knees, and finally, the heavy, grubby olive green jacket. "Hold it right there." Cowbell's voice cracked like a whip in the silence of the room. Sarah froze mid-stride. "Miss, exactly what do you think you are doing?" Cowbell demanded, leaning forward on his high bench. "You were called to testify, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice firm and clear. "In my courtroom," Cowbell sneered, gesturing vaguely at her clothes. "You look like you just crawled out of a dumpster. This is a court of law, Miss Henkins, not a homeless shelter, not a gym. A strict dress code is respected here. You are showing a profound disrespect to this institution." "Your Honor, I apologize," Sarah said, holding her posture rigid. "I'm the head charge nurse at Mercedes Scripps Hospital. I just got off a 36-hour trauma emergency shift after a mass casualty incident on the interstate. I came straight here to speak on behalf of Mr. Hickens because it is a matter of life and death." Cowbell waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care if you were delivering the president's baby, Miss Henkins. You are not taking the stand in my courtroom wearing that filthy, oversized rag. Take off that jacket immediately, or I will find you in contempt and strike your presence from the record." James Hickens turned to look at Sarah, panic flashing in his eyes. He shook his head slightly, mouthing the word, "No." He knew about the jacket. He knew what was underneath. Sarah didn't move. The air in the room seemed to grow thick and heavy with the impending collision of two immovable forces. "Your Honor," Sarah said, dropping her voice a fraction of an octave, losing the polite deference of a civilian and adopting the hard, flat edge of a soldier. "I mean no disrespect to this court, but I cannot take off this jacket." Judge Cowbell's face flushed a deep, angry red. He grabbed his gavel and slammed it down with a deafening crack. "Can't, or won't," Cowbell roared. "Let me make something very clear to you, young lady. You do not run this courtroom. I do not tolerate insubordination. You will take off that piece of surplus military garbage right now, or you will spend the next 48 hours in a holding cell." The public defender jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, please, my witness has been saving lives all night. Sit down, counselor," Cowbell snapped. He turned his furious gaze back to Sarah. "Bailiff, if the witness refuses to comply with the decorum of this court, assist her in removing the garment." Two burly bailiffs stepped forward from the walls, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. Sarah did not retreat. Instead, she squared her shoulders. "Don't touch me," she said to the advancing bailiffs. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm order that made both armed men hesitate. Cowbell leaned over the bench, squinting as he examined the jacket. He spotted the dirt-caked Velcro patch on her right shoulder. "What is that?" Cowbell sneered, pointing a trembling finger. "Is that what all this is about? Some kind of juvenile gang apparel? What does it say there? Pantom for? What kind of ridiculous, childish cosplay are you engaged in, Miss Henkins? Do you think you're in a video game? Do you think dressing up gives you the right to mock my courtroom?" The ghost in the courtroom. Outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 402, the hallway was usually quiet, but that day the courthouse was hosting a joint jurisdiction task force meeting related to a major federal smuggling case. Walking down the marble corridor was Admiral Arthur Hughes. Hughes was a towering figure in naval special warfare. A Navy SEAL who had risen to the highest echelons of the United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, he exuded a quiet, terrifying authority. Dressed in his immaculate blue dress uniform, a constellation of medals and ribbons adorning his chest, he was flanked by a group of federal prosecutors and military aides. They were passing right by Judge Cowbell's courtroom when the judge's voice boomed through the heavy wood, amplified by his microphone. "What is that? Pantom 4. What kind of ridiculous, childish cosplay are you engaged in?" Admiral Hughes stopped dead in his tracks. The sudden halt caused his entourage to stumble awkwardly behind him. "Admiral?" a perplexed federal prosecutor asked. Hughes didn't answer. The blood had completely drained from his weathered face. His jaw clenched tight. "Pantom 4. It wasn't a video game, it wasn't a costume. 4 years ago, during a highly classified, black box operation in the hostile mountains of Yemen, a joint SOCOM task force had been compromised. A Black Hawk helicopter had been shot down. The rescue convoy drove into an ambush. In the ensuing massacre, the team's lead medic, a specially trained, deeply undercover female operator attached to the SEAL teams under the Cultural Support Team framework, had single-handedly held off a platoon of insurgents for 6 hours. She had dragged 4 wounded SEALs into a fortified cave, operating on them in the dark with a headlamp and a dwindling medical kit, taking 2 bullets in her arms in the process. That medic's call sign was Pantom 4. The official military report stated that Pantom 4 had sustained catastrophic, career-ending injuries. She had been quietly retired for medical reasons, her file sealed under the highest classification protocols. Hughes, who had been the commanding officer of the operation from the Tactical Operations Center, had never met her in person. He had only ever heard her voice over the radio, calm and steady as the world burned around her, reporting triage statuses while returning fire. Hughes shoved the federal prosecutor aside and threw the heavy oak doors of the courtroom open. Inside, the scene was frozen in a tense standoff. The 2 bailiffs were reaching for Sarah's arms. Sarah stood perfectly rigid, her jaw set, preparing to fight her way out of the courtroom before letting them tear off her jacket. "Bailiff, get that jacket off her now," Cowbell shouted, completely out of patience. "Touch her and I'll have federal marshals arrest you for assaulting a military officer." A voice boomed from the back of the room. "Stand down." The entire courtroom snapped their heads around. Admiral Hughes stood in the center aisle, his presence radiating an overwhelming, suffocating gravity. He didn't walk, he advanced toward the front of the courtroom like a battleship cutting through the water. Cowbell blinked, momentarily unsettled by the sheer amount of gold braid and decorations entering his domain. "Excuse me, who do you think you are to burst into my courtroom? We are in the middle of a trial." "I am Admiral Arthur Hughes, United States Navy," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. He ignored the judge entirely, his eyes fixed on the back of the woman in the faded olive green jacket. Sarah turned slowly, regarding the Admiral with an unreadable expression. Hughes stopped less than 3 feet from her. He took in the scorched nylon. He looked at the permanent bloodstains near the hem, blood he knew with absolute certainty belonged to his men. Finally, he looked at her face, recognizing the hollow, haunted eyes of a warrior who had survived the unsurvivable. "Stand down, Judge," Hughes said softly without taking his eyes off Sarah. "I will do no such thing," Cowbell sputtered, regaining his indignation. "I don't care if you are the Secretary of Defense. This woman is in contempt. She is refusing to remove an inappropriate and disrespectful garment, and she will be sanctioned." "She can't take it off, Your Honor." James Hickens spoke up suddenly from the defense table, his voice trembling with raw emotion. Tears were silently streaming down the young veteran's face. "Please, Judge, don't make her." Cowbell slammed his gavel again. "And why not? Because she's grown too attached to a dirty jacket?" Sarah closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. The courtroom was utterly silent. She extended trembling fingers and pulled down the zipper of the olive green jacket. When the heavy material fell away, slumping to the floor with a soft thud, a collective gasp rippled through the jury and the gallery. Even the prosecutor covered her mouth in shock. Beneath the jacket, Sarah wore a sleeveless scrub top. From her elbows to her shoulders, both arms were a horrifying, twisted landscape of deep scars, puckered burn tissue, and surgical skin grafts. The trauma was so severe, so visually jarring, that it was immediately evident she had narrowly avoided double amputation. On her right forearm, deeply scarred but still legible, was a tattoo of a trident and a date. She didn't wear the jacket to be disrespectful. She wore it because the civilian world looked at her arms with horror, and the jacket was the only thing that stood between her trauma and their pity. Judge Cowbell's gavel slipped from his hand and clattered loudly onto his desk. The color drained from his arrogant face. Admiral Hughes didn't look at her arms, he looked her straight in the eyes. He slowly raised his hand in a salute so sharp and precise it was like a knife cutting through the air. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person, Pantum IV," the Admiral said, his voice thick with an emotion no one in the room had ever heard from a man of his rank. "My men came home because of you." The silence in courtroom 402 was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the ragged breathing of James Hickens from the defense table. Sarah Henkins slowly lowered her arms. The brutal expanse of scar tissue and skin grafts glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, a visceral map of unimaginable sacrifice. She bent down, picked up the tactical jacket from the floor, and carefully placed it back over her shoulders. She didn't zip it up. She didn't have to. The armor had already served its purpose. Admiral Arthur Hughes lowered his hand from the salute. He turned his imposing frame to face the bench, pinning Judge Richard Cowbell with a stare cold enough to freeze salt water. "Your Honor," Hughes began, his voice dangerously quiet, "that piece of surplus military garbage you just ordered this woman to remove is the only thing standing between a decorated American hero and the ignorant stares of a public that has absolutely no idea what she gave up for their safety. She earned the right to wear whatever she damn well pleases in this city, in this state, and certainly in this courtroom." Cowbell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing over his immaculate white collar. The righteous indignation that usually fueled his courtroom tyranny had completely evaporated. "Admiral, I was unaware of the witness's medical history. The court apologizes for the misunderstanding." "Don't apologize to me, Judge," Hughes snapped. "Apologize to her." Cowbell turned his gaze toward Sarah, unable to look at her scarred arms. "Miss Henkins, the court offers you its sincerest apologies. May you proceed to the witness stand." Sarah walked to the wooden enclosure, her posture rigid. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat. The public defender, sweating profusely and clearly energized by the sudden shift in the courtroom's dynamic, approached the podium. "Miss Henkins," the lawyer began, clearing his throat, "can you tell the court how you know the defendant, James Hickens?" "We met in a traumatic rehabilitation group at the Veterans Affairs Department 3 years ago," Sarah replied, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "James was struggling to adjust to civilian life. I became a sort of mentor to him. We share a history in combat medicine." "And in your professional and personal opinion, is James Hickens a violent man? Is he a danger to society as the prosecution claims?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "James is a protector. That is a fundamental psychological difference that civilians often fail to grasp. He is trained to neutralize a deadly threat and then immediately transition to saving the lives of the same people who were just trying to kill him." The lead prosecutor, an aggressive, well-paid attorney named William Torney, rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is testifying to the defendant's mental state, which is irrelevant to the fact that he brutally assaulted my client, Bradley Reed." "Objection overruled," Cowbell said softly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I want to hear what she has to say." The public defender continued, "Miss Henkins, you reviewed the ER admission records of the men James allegedly assaulted. You were the head charge nurse the night they were admitted. Can you explain what you found?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes boring into Richard Davis. "The prosecution claims James flew into a blind rage and beat those men nearly to death. The medical records tell an entirely different story, one of surgical precision and restraint." She pulled a folded medical report from her pocket. "Bradley Reed, the son of the prominent developer who is funding this prosecution, suffered a broken jaw and a fractured orbital bone. But what the prosecution conveniently omitted from their briefs is the emergency cricothyrotomy performed on Mr. Reed in the alley before the paramedics even arrived." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor's face went pale. What? Judge Cowbell asked, leaning forward. An emergency airway puncture, Sarah explained, her tone adopting the clinical chill of a trauma nurse. Mr. Reed's jaw was shattered, and he was drowning in his own blood and broken teeth. He had less than 2 minutes to live. Someone took a standard ink pen, disassembled it, performed a perfect vertical incision below Mr. Reed's thyroid cartilage, and inserted the plastic tube to establish an airway. That procedure saved his life. She pointed directly at James. A violent thug in a blind rage does not shatter a man's jaw and then instantly perform battlefield surgery to ensure he survives the night. James neutralized 3 men who had cornered a young waitress. Then he saved the lead attacker's life. The prosecutor, Richard Davis, jumped to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. Your Honor, this is outrageous speculation. The paramedics could have performed that procedure. I spoke with the paramedics, Mr. Davis, Sarah replied, her voice slicing through his outburst like a scalpel. Paramedics carry standardized intubation kits. They don't use bloodied Bic pens. Furthermore, the angle of the fracture on Mr. Reed's dominant right wrist is a classic defensive wound, specifically the type of fracture that occurs when a trained operative disarms a combatant holding a lethal weapon. The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. A lethal weapon? Cowbell demanded over the noise, banging his gavel. Mr. Davis, there was no mention of a weapon in the police report. Your client claimed they were simply having a verbal disagreement with the waitress when the defendant attacked them without provocation. Sarah didn't wait for the lawyer to stumble over a defense. Mr. Reed pulled a switchblade on the waitress, Your Honor. I know this because when my team cut off Mr. Reed's designer jacket in the trauma bay, the knife fell out of his inner pocket. I personally logged it into the hospital's secure evidence locker. I brought the chain of custody receipt with me today. She handed a yellow carbon copy paper to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge. Cowbell stared at the paper. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to explosive. The verdict and the aftermath. The prominent real estate developer, sitting in the front row, shot to his feet, his face purple with rage, looking as if he wanted to murder his own legal team. Mr. Davis, Cowbell said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Is it true that your client was carrying an illegal concealed weapon during this altercation, a weapon that was deliberately omitted from the initial police report through what I can only assume was significant external pressure? The prosecutor stared down at his legal pads, his silence his own condemnation. I am issuing a judicial subpoena for that weapon immediately, Cowbell announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He turned to the young veteran at the defense table. Mr. Hickens, given the serious suppression of evidence by the alleged victims and the compelling medical testimony presented today, I am dismissing all charges against you with prejudice. You are free to go. James collapsed forward onto the table, burying his face in his hands as deep, racking sobs shook his shoulders. Cowbell then looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Davis, you and your client will remain seated. We are going to have a very long conversation about perjury and the filing of false police reports. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of courtroom 402 opened, and Sarah stepped out into the marble hallway. She was exhausted. Her bones ached, and the phantom pains in her scarred arms throbbed with a dull, familiar fire. She felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Admiral Hughes standing there, his escort waiting respectfully a few yards away. Pantom 4, Hughes said softly. Just Sarah now, sir, she replied, offering a tired smile. Pantom died in those mountains. No, she didn't, Hughes said, looking back toward the courtroom doors where James Hickens was embracing his weeping public defender. She just changed battlefields. The way you analyzed that tactical situation on the stand, you're still operating Hankins. Just without a rifle. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black challenge coin emblazoned with the gold seal of the Naval Special Warfare Command. He pressed it into her scarred palm. If you ever get tired of dealing with civilian hospital administration, the Admiral said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, I have a training facility in Coronado that desperately needs a senior instructor in combat trauma management. Name your price. The job is yours. Sarah looked down at the heavy coin in her hand, feeling the embossed metal against her damaged nerves. She looked back up at the Admiral, the ghosts of Yemen momentarily fading from her vision, replaced by the bright, chaotic reality of the emergency room that needed her. "Thank you, Admiral," Sarah said, zipping up her olive green jacket. "But my shift starts again in 12 hours. I've got plenty more lives to save right here." She turned and walked down the marble hallway, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly, leaving the Admiral to watch as the bravest ghost he had ever known disappeared back into the civilian world. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah Jenkins didn't feel like she was walking alone. She carried the weight of her past, the scars on her arms, and the knowledge that her battle, though changed, was far from over. She was Pantom 4, and she was still saving lives. If you felt the power of Sarah's sacrifice and her fierce dedication to the truth, hit the like button right now. Stories of invisible heroes who walk among us deserve to be told. Share this video with a friend to honor our veterans and frontline medical workers. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for more incredible, real-life drama every week.